I'm going to talk next about the history of Colombia's drug trafficking industry. To properly understand it though, we first need to know exactly why it came to be, and the answer to that lies in the history of drug consumption in the United States. See, drug consumption and specifically drug abuse had been an issue in the US for a long time. In the late 1800s, medicinal opium was widely used for medicinal purposes, but a lack of proper regulation via prescriptions gave way to an epidemic of opium addiction. The Civil War only expanded on this issue of drug addiction, with morphine in particular becoming an addiction among many injured soldiers, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as soldier's disease. Then around the turn of the 20th century, cocaine became widely introduced as a medicine, in many cases as a treatment for opium addiction, and a stimulant in many products such as Coca-Cola. As we know though, cocaine carries many addictive properties of its own, which the government soon picked up on. By 1914, therefore, a new tax on producers, sellers, and distributors of the drug caused its availability to become far more restricted, effectively all but criminalizing it outside of medicinal use. This law, known as the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, would be one of the nation's first forays into a restrictive drug policy, paving the way for a broader moral panic about drug use. Sensationalist newspapers, for instance, would often exaggerate the link between narcotic use and violent crime, in many cases drawing racial connections as well. Later, many other drugs were popularized, such as heroin, amphetamines, and marijuana, all of which eventually received their own restrictions such as prohibitive taxes that limited their distribution. During the 1960s and 70s, the US saw another huge rise in drug use, now becoming one of the world's largest drug consumers, if not the largest. This was in part due to a rising countercultural movement that embraced recreational drug use as a symbol of rebellion and personal freedom. In 1971, the Nixon administration officially declared a war on drugs, citing it as public enemy number one. A couple of years later, he established the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. This administration was a consolidation of several earlier drug enforcement and intelligence agencies, such as the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs and the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement. With this amalgamation came stronger authority aimed at enforcing drug laws on a global scale. Although the Nixon administration's anti-drug initiatives were universally applicable, many historians argue that the real target of this drug war was marginalized communities. For many years, drugs had received a racially charged connotation to certain communities, such as marijuana with Mexican immigrants, cocaine with African American communities in the South, and opium with Chinese immigrants. As such, drug patrolling became particularly prominent in these communities, in spite of the questionable validity behind these cultural associations. Although the claims of these communities being the largest consumers of drugs were largely inaccurate and driven by racist stereotypes, it was true, however, that large quantities of drugs in the US were being supplied by other countries. By the late 1960s, Mexico was the US's largest supplier of marijuana, and by the 1970s, their largest supplier of heroin. To combat this, the US government launched many anti-drug campaigns that would target Mexican marijuana production and smuggling. One of these was known as Operation Intercept, which instigated compulsory drug searches for all road, foot, and air traffic crossing the Mexico border. The clampdown on Mexico, however, would only cause drug producers to relocate their operations to other countries, such as Colombia. Colombia had several advantages as a drug producer and distributor. For starters, it was bordered by two oceans and contained huge frontiers of fertile land. Much of this land lacked any proper governance or state presence, making it relatively easy for farmers to cultivate their crops in secret. For many of these farmers, cannabis cultivation was also incentivized as a lucrative alternative to underperforming legal crops at the time. Despite Colombia's brief success in the marijuana trade, however, demand for weed would soon fall by the late 70s when many from the US began to cultivate cannabis on their own soil. Rather than exiting the drug trade altogether though, Colombian traffickers would merely diversify. Though the marijuana trade had shrunken, traffickers would very soon find a new lucrative opportunity in smuggling cocaine, another drug that had recently skyrocketed in popularity in the US. With much of the infrastructure for drug smuggling in place already, this transition was extremely rapid. At the time, Bolivia and Peru were the two leading countries for coca production, so Colombia would instead become a processing hub. Here, producers would establish cocaine labs known as kitchens, where coca paste could easily be processed into high-purity powder in a matter of days, allowing for rapid dispatchment. The kitchens were far from the only infrastructure employed by traffickers though. To break the smuggler's journey, for instance, an airstrip spanning almost a kilometre along with a yacht harbour would be constructed on an island in the Bahamas. Its geographic location would allow for strategic stopovers for pilots before they flew on to Florida not far north. Though many participated in the trade, the most famous of these trafficking operations was run by a man you may know as Pablo Escobar. Previously a small-time car thief, Escobar would get his start in the business by setting up coca labs in Antioquia and the Magdalena River Valley. These operations proved wildly successful, and before long would attract the attention of many investors looking for stakes in the business. Beyond his success, the investors were also attracted to a key strategy Escobar employed: risk insurance. This was something he'd sell to smugglers, allowing for compensation in the case that drugs were lost or seized by authorities. By the late 1970s, narcotics imports from Colombia were a well-established issue, and the US government was more determined than ever to act. In 1977, therefore, newly elected President Jimmy Carter sent psychiatrist and director of the White House's Office of Drug Abuse Policy, Peter Bourne, to confront Colombian President Alfonso López on the issue. He carried with him a stern letter from Carter addressed to López, which came attached with a document from Bourne known as the Bourne Memorandum. The document stressed the severity of the situation, highlighting the inadequacy of Colombia and the US's efforts in combating narcotic trafficking and the needs for both countries to improve their cooperation against it. Most notably, however, it contained a list of all known public officials in Colombia suspected to be in the pay of narco-traffickers. After meeting with López, Bourne perceived that the Colombian president firmly understood the severity of the issue and was more than willing to improve their cooperation. Therefore, he reported back to the White House that a breakthrough could be expected, prompting Carter to report to Congress a month later that the issue was a high priority for López. The reality, however, turned out to be the complete opposite. López outright refused to take action against anyone on the list, including his two accused ministers. In an attempt to shake things up, someone likely from the Carter administration would later leak the Bourne Memorandum to the crew of CBS's 60 Minutes, who would then relay some of the list on their show. Aired in 1978, this segment would cause stark outrage in both the US and Colombia, though for very different reasons. In the US, viewers were astounded by the alleged extent of drug corruption. In Colombia, however, viewers were outraged by what they perceived to be a public shaming campaign. For many, it felt as though the US was villainizing their country without taking responsibility for the significant role their cocaine demand played. Later that year, one of the men listed on the Bourne Memorandum, Julio Cesar Turbay Ayala, would become the new president of Colombia. In an attempt to distract from his ties to drug traffickers, Turbay took stern action against the trade. One of his first initiatives was to organize the spreading of a toxic herbicide across cannabis farms in northern Colombia. This would prove highly controversial, as the herbicide would also sometimes contaminate nearby rural water sources and food crops, causing grave health implications. Beyond this, military troops would also conduct routine searches across drug cultivation regions and arrest suspected farmers. Sadly, these campaigns would also cause unjust damage to local communities. Due to a lack of reliable intelligence, raids would often include mass arrests, with little investigation into the actual actions of each individual. From an enforcement perspective, these searches also largely failed to put a dent in the drug trade. Though many of the arrested were certainly complicit in cultivation, few had direct involvement in processing, trafficking, or any other cartel operations. In spite of this, raids would continue to be carried out on a grand scale. Looking beyond the drug trade, emerging guerrilla activity throughout the 70s would also prove to be a nation-leading issue. Besides the existing FARC, ELN, and EPL insurgencies, another large guerrilla group known as the 19th of April Movement, or M19, would form around 1974. The catalyst for their formation was the supposedly mysterious defeat of their preferred presidential candidate, the aforementioned General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, in the 1970 presidential election. Many activists believe that Rojas' defeat was an act of electoral fraud, considering that he appeared to be winning the popular vote late into the night of election day. 4 years later, these activists, consisting of disillusioned breakaway liberals along with communists and radicalized students, would retaliate by taking up arms and mobilizing into M19, named after the date of the 1970 election. Ideologically, the group championed democratic populism, embracing symbols of anti-corruption and sovereignty, often inspired by Simón Bolívar. In fact, one of their first acts as a group was to steal Bolívar's sword from a museum, using it as a symbolic emblem of his supposed unfinished struggle. To combat M19, along with other insurgents, President Turbay would launch a new security initiative in 1978 known as the Estatuto de Seguridad, or the Security Statute. The main purpose of the statute was to enlist the military to enforce public order wherever necessary. Notably, it also allowed the military to try any civilian suspected of drug trade links in secret. Such leeway was arguably abused, with arrests not limited to criminals or even suspected criminals, but rather anyone suspected of radical leftist ideologies. Before long, arbitrary raids and detentions would be carried out en masse across the country, especially in rural and marginalised communities. By 1979, an estimated 60,000 civilians were being held in custody, many of whom were reportedly tortured. Understandably, the security statute would therefore draw deep condemnation from international human rights organisations. By the late 1980s, Colombia's illegal drug trade was worth roughly 5% of the country's GDP, estimated between $2 to $4 billion per annum, far outweighing revenue for many other large exports, including coffee. Narco-traffickers at the top of the food chain would use this wealth to fund lavish lifestyles while buying out entire shopping centres, soccer clubs, hotels, and large companies to use as fronts for the trade, along with a significant percentage of the country's farmlands. To distract from their operations and garner positive public reception, meanwhile, some traffickers would also finance vital infrastructure in impoverished areas, such as schools and health clinics, thereby winning the loyalty of many among the lower class. In the countryside, however, it was a different story. Here, narco-traffickers would often enlist paramilitary groups to kill anyone who posed a risk or inconvenience to their operations, such as peasant farmers, rival dealers, and certain guerrilla factions. Both massacres and violent land sieges would soon become commonplace in these areas, ushering in a new era of rural terror. Whilst the trade was undoubtedly lucrative for some within it, the effect it had on the rest of the country was a very different story. Although the surge of foreign currency led to a significant appreciation of the Colombian peso, any inference of a stronger economy was pure illusion. On the contrary, GDP per capita outside of illegal industries would plummet by 36% between 1981 and 91. By this point, the market had become truly distorted, as legitimate businesses just couldn't compete with enterprises backed by swaths of laundered money. Meanwhile, the injection of narco dollars into the economy was causing huge inflation, especially in real estate prices in large cities such as Medellin and Bogotá. Speculative real estate bubbles would soon give way to overdevelopment in wealthier areas, while poorer neighbourhoods saw few such initiatives, giving way to a sharp rise in the nation's already pervasive wealth disparity. To make matters worse, these injustices would be harder than ever to deal with, as the trade had also infiltrated political institutions, law enforcement, and judiciary, compromising the process for legal reform. Understandably, such corruption would deeply undermine public trust in Colombia's democratic institutions and dampen hope for justice.